Thanks. So there would probably be some back and forth up here, but rather than do that, let's see if there's questions from the audience, and maybe we'll do our back and forth in the context of answering questions. Yes.
I'm Roberta Stanley from Michigan. I used to work on the House Ed and Labor Committee in a better era. Recently, there's been talk in the U.S. House of Representatives about revisiting the Holden Amendment, which permits the administration to target individual employees and cut their pay. Would any of you like to put that in perspective and comment on that, please?
Can you explain that amendment more?
Holden Amendment is from the 1800s, and it permits authorities to single out an individual employee and cut their pay to $1.
Congress could pass a law that says,
It was a law. They're gonna, put it back into force.
yeah, that would.
Like in a massive document, like if they did another sequester or a big massive budget document, they could slip it in as a side amendment in the last page. And the majority of members don't read those entire bills. So it would get in without.
Well, would it hold with unions? Would it supersede union contracts?
Yes. It's like wherever we knew union history, union law, practice and procedure in our country is going down the drain with these folks. It's like, it's more than a slap in the face. It's like denying our history and how we've evolved.
Go ahead, Dan.
I'll say a brief word. I've often thought that there's one major lesson from history. I'll say a brief word vaguely about it. I've often thought from history there's only one real lesson, even though you think things can't get worse, they can. I don't know, maybe even if you are. And I think one should be very concerned that the very future of collective bargaining for public employees is, as it were, on the table. And it is not implausible to imagine this administration, this Congress, and this Supreme Court working in collusion to overturn a half century of public bargaining to the detriment of teachers, children, communities, and democracy itself. So what you're describing is part of a wider assault on public employees, public unions, public servants. And in that respect, one of the things to think about in terms of this panel is the degree to which no distinction was really made between teachers' unions before and after collective bargaining. And, the history of ideological disputes, which I've written about, is most fun to write about in the period before collective bargaining because the positions are most vivid. While I've been critical of Al Shanker, one of the things that's clear is that he had to negotiate a membership that was different from the membership of the Teachers Union or the Teachers Guild. In 1968, a large portion of New York City teachers were members of the Jewish Teachers Association, which endorsed Mayor Kahani's right-wing extremism. So Shanker's, even if he's to the left of where, or to the right of where he should have been, he's to the left of a large percentage of his membership.
Yeah.
So I think what you're describing is part of a concern, and we have to figure out how to think about.
This is so arcane and old. Most people haven't.
Right. That's what.
Can I just say one thing quickly? And I think you're right that so Shanker would be to the right of many people on this panel. In the larger American context, he's a democratic socialist, right? So he's on the left of American society, trying to make inroads for important democratic values, but isn't sufficiently left for our some of our tastes here. One other thing is that I think, Roberta, your question is absolutely right. It goes to this larger issue of, why is the right so obsessed with unions? And if it were true that unions only went after the narrow interests of their workers, then I don't think conservatives would be as upset with them. It's precisely because they are part of a larger social justice movement that they want to be make sure that they're defunded. So if we ask, why do we have a system of public education in this country? Why haven't we gone to widespread vouchers? It's because of the political muscle of the teachers' unions. And that's what makes the Friedrichs case and the attacks on public sector unions so important to the right wing, because because public sector unions are so much broader in their impact than just for their members.
Just want to say one possibly good thing about the Holden Amendment is it might hold for union and non-union people, right? So,
I really need to go back in history and read it.
I mean, that's not a good thing, but I mean, I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily target union people. It targets independent workers too, which is.
Jamie?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. One is the black hole of New York City. I mean, Margaret Haley was a strong local organizer in Chicago of women elementary Irish Catholic school teachers, elementary. And then these people from New York City come, and they're guys, mostly secondary level, vocationally trained, not all of them, but some of them, and they didn't like each other. That's my take. But I think the lesson there, which is a good point you're making, is that local matters. The difference between the Chicago Teachers Union today and the UFT is also significant. I mean, each city has its own distinctive character of its union. And I'd also like to get out of the cities and look at the local unions, what's going on in smaller cities and communities, and how those dynamics work. So I think that's one thing. I think that's the New York-Chicago thing. And then it also speaks to something about Margaret Haley, too, is that she was a very difficult person. I mean, I think every union leader I've ever met was a difficult person. I mean, you kind of have to be, So she really didn't want to work with. Once you get outside of your local, it's not as easy to control the situation, the dynamics, and the politics. And you're right, it was a long way away, and there were these guys telling her what to do, and she didn't like it. So, in that way, and she did back out after about 1917. It was partially because there were policies in Chicago that worked against it, but also she didn't really want to go national. Others may have other takes on this.
So maybe to sharpen some of the conversation up here, it seems to me that what's at contest is really two different visions for how one advances an African American freedom struggle, and I think it's worth investigating them. And so I think that the traditions of democratic socialism or social democracy, which inspire the teachers' movement, teachers' union, and teachers' guild, and the UFT. They have many different facets. Obviously, one facet of a democratic socialism is an opposition to Stalinism. But I think equally important is this notion that you can't advance political rights or civil rights without also advancing economic rights, and that is very, very important. That's the vision that the Teachers Guild and the UFT is pushing, and there's a remarkable convergence there, which is why the loyalty of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin is so strong. There's a remarkable convergence there between the union's democratic socialism and the democratic socialism not only of Randolph and Rustin, but also of King himself. And so up until the point which King's assassinated, King is a very strong supporter of the UFT. And I think there's a couple of facets to that we discussed that are important. The first is that the union's understanding is that if you simply try to integrate schools by moving students without addressing the underlying inequality, that all you're going to do is create white middle class flight. You're going to end up with a school system that's more segregated and worse off than before. And so you have to have a program, what in today's parlance we would call community schools, that put the resources, the supports, the extra teachers, the guidance counselors and all of that. You need to have that in inner city schools to be able to do racial integration that's successful. And so that's the battle, I think, in the 50s and the late 50s and the 60s over whether that's going to happen. And the combination of the two, I think, is essential. And it's precisely because there is that convergence that admittedly at great personal cost, Randolph and Rustin are not prepared. And I'm sure if King were alive, he would have taken the same position. We're not prepared to turn on the union, especially also given the fact that there had been all of this support that the union had given to the civil rights movement all the way along. And I think, you know, there is certainly in the 60s, the late 60s, there is this turn away from that vision in the form of the Black Power movement. And it's certainly true that Rustin and Randolph are not able to move that vision of jobs and freedom that was at the 1963 march. There's many reasons for that. I would argue that the primary reason is the Vietnam War. But I would say that it's in fact, it is the great historical tragedy is that they were unable to do that, because the consequences of being unable to do that, and to the extent to which Black Power replaced that larger social democratic socialist vision, the Black freedom struggle was completely stalled. And if there is a way to move forward in the current context, particularly in terms of education, and there is now the beginnings, I think, of a movement to look again seriously at the question of school integration in a way that we really haven't done, for almost a half century. If there's a way to move forward, it has to take seriously the need to address economic inequality in tandem with the question of school racial integration and class integration.
The Guild took a position that was opposed to sending in qualified teachers, sending in experienced teachers into Black and Latino communities. The teachers, Charlie Coogan and the Teachers Guild response to that was integration, yes, forced transfers, no. And they pushed for something for voluntary transfers, and they said we should add money, pay teachers, and then in order to go into those schools, the teachers nicknamed that extra pay combat pay. This was, of course, insulting to Black and Latino communities. Now, I can go back further and talk about the position that the Guild took when it came to the professional staff and Black children. We have a case in Harlem where you had a principal who beat up a student who was not a member of the school, was not in the school, but his sister was in school. He came there to see her after school, and the principal beat this student. It is the teachers union that came out and said that principals like this should be fired. It's the Guild that came out in support of that principal. That was a turnoff to the Black community. When we talk about this long civil rights history of the American Federation of Teachers, I don't don't see it. Yes, no doubt that Al Shanker supported the sit-ins. There's no doubt he had a relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. But what was going on the ground in New York City is important. And that he did not have, and then the UFT did not have a strong relationship with Black and Latino parents. So that relationship did not begin in 1968. The deterioration did not take place in 1968. It took place long before 1968.
I'm going to pick up on this as well, and I guess not surprisingly, I'll agree more with Clarence than Leo. And I think it's important to reframe Leo's comment, which was essentially, what can we do about making the African American freedom struggle viable, to what can we do to make social democracy viable? And there, the issues between the Guild and the teachers union didn't revolve so much around one's relationship to Stalin, but around a different vision of militancy, of teacher organizing, and a question of what would it take to jumpstart a kind of social democracy in the United States. And the teachers' unions, and indeed communist analysis, was that it required some sort of coalition with a African American freedom struggle and community which had some independence of, some autonomy from labor, from the working class. And if you go then to 1968, I mean, I have a different reading than Rich in that I think that Bayard Rustin was much more not psychologically harmed by having to support the union, but that he saw it as a lesser, he described it as the lesser of two evils, which is very different from saying this remains a vibrant strategy for making sense. How can we honor the politics of a kind of social democracy with the politics of recognition? And again, that's what we haven't figured out how to do, and that the teachers' union had a more sophisticated, active, militant stance towards that from the 30s on through than the AFT did. It is true that 19 teachers were dismissed in Ocean Hill or transferred. We can argue what it was, but that wasn't the first time teachers in New York were subjected to what were perceived as unfair disciplinary actions. It is the first time that the union shut down the school system for half a year, whatever, several months, in response. And the failure of the union was to not figure out a way that it could further a politics of its own with a politics of representing Black activists and community activists of all stripes. It wasn't, after all, only people outside of labor who were critical of the AFT, but a large number of Black unionists, including Richard Parrish, one of the highest-ranking Blacks in the AFT, was alienated from the union over the issue of Ocean Hill-Brownsville. Cleveland Robinson, a list of Black New York labor leaders committed to social democracy, committed to rights for workers, were alienated from the UFT over the strike. And the UFT's failure to move in a more sophisticated way that would build a coalition to the benefit of teachers, communities, and children was, as I said, one of its great failures.
I mean, if you're Al Shanker and you're head of the union and you have 19 teachers who are fired, I mean, this is the words of Rhodey McCoy, who's the local superintendent. There's a debate about, is it a transfer or is it fired? Not one of these teachers will be allowed to teach anywhere in this city. The Black community will see to that. Seems pretty definitive. What are you going to do? Are you going to stand by and say, let's forget about the rights of teachers under a union? let's forget about this whole effort to try to integrate school and instead carve out different areas for different races. Are we going to suddenly say that because it's white teachers being fired, now it's okay to fire by race? I mean, to me, there was no choice in this matter for what a progressive union leader should want to do. And to me, the fact that we're still debating this all these years later goes a long ways to explaining why we have Donald Trump as president. I mean, that when you hear that kind of an argument, what are average Americans, what are white working class Americans going to think when this is the defense that, well, it depends on whose ox is being gored. So to me, we'll probably agree, Dan, that this was a pivotal moment for American liberalism, and
its collapse.
And its collapse, and we might have different diagnoses as to why, but to my mind, that's the great lesson, is that if we are so focused not on the broader issues of advancing social justice, but rather, representational or recognition politics, I guess you were talking about, then that automatically leads to white working class people who should be on our side wanting their own form of recognition politics, which is very dangerous and led us to, I think, where we are.
I would simply say, and I should probably bring this to a close soon, but I do think this last piece is a very important piece. And I would simply say that I think it's a mistake to, the 1968 strike is in many ways a Greek tragedy, in which there are not heroes on either side, but this is my own personal estimation of it. But people engaged in a set of divisions that turn out badly for all sides. But I think it's a serious mistake to transform that into that this is somehow the union versus the black community. Because that's not what's happening, and it's not the history. So the history is in fact the Union allied with a very important, and one might even say dominant, strain in the African American community, from A. Philip Randolph and Lael Lane down, and that's an alliance that is maintained through the '68 strike, and we can go into the details of it. But that's clearly what's happening, and there are always divisions. Certainly, those in African Americans in the Communist Party were not part of that alliance. They had a different view of how things should proceed. But when we formulate it in that term, I think we evade what are essentially the political questions that have to be addressed. The political questions of why we ended up where we did after the '68 strike. What went wrong? I don't think anybody on this panel would say that the aftermath of '68 was a positive one. But to pose the frame in that question, it's unthinkable how, if the '68 strike was simply the union versus the black community, how in a short matter of time the union could win a very important representation election to represent African American and Latino paraprofessionals. And so it is if we're going to learn the lessons of the 1968 strike, and we're going to figure out what that means in terms of a way going forward, I think we really need to go in and look at the question of what are the political strategies at stake, and what can we learn from the ways in which they worked and didn't work.
with parents today, and many of them supporting this reform movement, supporting charter schools, supporting vouchers. You have to ask yourself the question: how did we get here? And you can't just turn around and say that was 1968, and this began a long time ago. Black and Latino parents have distrusted the United Federation of Teachers, not beginning 1968, long before then. I grew up in the Black community. I mean, I knew how we talked about teachers and how we saw the union. So, if you want to keep pointing to 1968, then I don't think we're going to have any answers to how to address this problem today.
Well, I would say that I think that one of the things that's important in the wake of 1968 is the union working to try to overcome some of those divisions. And so that, what you see now in New York City, I think in the context of charter schools with their incredible support from Wall Street and others on the right, is I think a very strong alliance between the union and folks in the community, and that a lot of work has been done over a lot of years to repair some of the divisions opened up by the '68 strike, and that's work that continues to need to go on. But in the absence of any burning questions from the audience, I thank all of you who have stuck it out for what I hope has been at least an enlightening and interesting presentation. And on your behalf and on behalf of the AFT and the Shanker Institute, I would like to thank all of our panelists, especially Clarence, who in wounded state still made the special effort to participate. I'd like to thank all of you for having given us a very interesting session. Thank you.